Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Red Lettuce. Today's guest, we have Dakotah Lilly, a longtime internet mutual friend, an online cyberbully, comrade in arms. We are excited to have you with us finally. I'm so glad that we could also talk about this because I've always really wanted to talk about fascism with other communists, with other like left-wing people who don't just shout at everything they don't like and call it fascism. I really feel like that's what liberals do a lot, and so I resist that, and I critique any sort of like uncritical finger pointing like at Donald Trump. Oh, he's a fascist. Um, but first, can you tell us a little bit about your work and where people can find you, and if Twitter has unbanned you, and where you're not banned, and all that good gay shit?
Well, so my big thing is populism, left populism. Its incarnations in Argentina, in especially Venezuela. Venezuela is obviously like my bread and butter, but European brands and what the left in the United States needs to learn from these examples. That's why, I've been listening to a lot of Crystal Ball lately. I think she had really good things to say about her left populism talk with I think it was Jacobin. I consider myself a socialist. I consider myself someone who's on the left by far. I can be found on Facebook. I'm very active there. Obviously, my name is Dakotah Lilly. I was on Twitter twice. Both times got banned for no reason, which was given to me. That's still kind of the case. And I've kind of given up on Twitter, honestly, just because it's hard to rebuild your mutuals. And even when I got banned the second time, I was up to like 300 followers, down from like over 2,000 before. And that took a long time.
Yeah, remember that.
So I'm just trying to focus on Facebook. I'm trying to focus on Instagram, as most gay people should and do. I write a lot. I write for Popular Resistance. I write for Cindy Sheehan's Soapbox, the Orinoco Tribune, and I do a lot of podcasts. At least I try to do. I try to talk to Caleb Maupin on his live sometimes. I try to do what I can.
No, I just wanted to compliment that video you did with Caleb Maupin about which is the inspiration for why we're here.
Yeah, we caught that video and we're like, oh, we definitely want to talk about this. This definitely caught our interest, especially Fox, because as we were discussing earlier, there's hardly anything on the internet that you can find in English anyway about what Peronism is. So why don't we start there? Why don't we start with what is Peronism?
Well, how much time do you have? Peronism it's a political ideology that is considered by most people to be populist in nature. It's more than anything, I think it's nationalistic. So obviously the time period that Peronism came to fruition was in the midst of the Second World War and then the Cold War. Obviously, the main figures in Peronism were Juan Perón, the general, and his wife, Eva Duarte de Perón. Perón started off as the Minister for Labor. He was big in the trade union. He was big in the military. He was kind of part of this milieu of like progressive military leaders that came to power in Latin America in the 20th century, which there are a couple. We mainly think about the Caudillo. We think about the right-wing terrible military leaders, which there are plenty of across Latin America. But there was also a handful of progressive military leaders. The one that comes to mind besides Perón would be Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, who of course was deposed in a coup sponsored by the United Fruit Company and the United States. But that's kind of the milieu that he was coming from. So Peronism, from the mouth of the Peronists, whether it's the left, the right, no matter what they can agree on is the three defining flags of Peronism, and they are social justice, political sovereignty, and economic independence, which in the context of Argentina, obviously this is a country that has been ruled in a large part by the British, whether it was the railways or agriculture. You know, there was a lot of conglomerates, European colonizers, etc. So that's kind of where that comes from. And Peronism has taken on, you know, Peronism, like I believe every political process, it's not static, you know, it's not a straight line. There's been retreats, there's been advances, there's been bastardizations of it, you know, but I think it's really useful to look at what Peronism has achieved, you know, and kind of what I think a lot of people get wrong about Peronism is that it's automatically described as a right-wing, even pseudo-fascist ideology, which I disagree with characterizing it as. I think that there are some elements of Peronism that find that some fascists, you know, subscribe to, but I think there's some similarities in every ideology like that. I think any sort of radical ideology, any sort of quote unquote revolutionary ideology kind of has a certain amount of things in common no matter what. You know, for, you know, if we're communists, which I believe we are, you know, we reject liberalism. You know, the far right also rejects liberalism. They do it for very much different reasons, but that's something that, you know, we both do. So Peronism, you know, and Peronism has been in power in Argentina on and off since Peronism became a thing. One of the only time that Peronism hasn't been in power through a coup or a military junta was starting in 2016 with Mauricio Macri. And as we'll probably talk about in a little bit, that was a disaster for the people of Argentina. But to go back, I think Peronism, you know, when you look at the three flags of Peronism, if you look at the 20 Jucialist truths, that's what Jucialism is kind of, it's a combination of the words for like social justice and I forget, well, it's mainly social justice. It's supposedly justiceism.
Right.
And that was kind of the big thing was at the time, Perron, and this is something I will admit to, Perron and Peronism rejected both capitalism and communism. But if you look in deeper as to what Perron meant by communism, he was taking cues from what the Soviet Union meant by communism. So he said, and I can get a quote up here in a little bit, is that it wasn't just an opposition to capitalism, it was an opposition to state capitalism, what he described as the replacement of the oligarchy of corporations by an oligarchy of the bureaucrats. You know, whether or not we agree with whether or not Soviet Union was a bureaucratic oligarchy, as someone who was in the third camp, that's what I believe a lot of people believed. You know, Mao Zedong believed the same thing. Gaddafi believed the same thing. Bhaskar Sankara. You know, there was all these milieus of nationalist socialism that were rooted in national oppression that kind of rejected both influence of both the Soviet Union and the United States. So I think that to say that he was anti-communist, I think is a little bit much, because if you look at a lot of the people who then took up the flags of Peronism after Perron died, if you look at the Montoneros and the People's Revolutionary Army, I mean, these were communists. If you look at the relationship that Perron had with Mao Zedong, it was very amicable. He, you know, he was very, very supportive of Mao and the revolution in China. And So it's complicated to say the least. But I think you find much more similar. Even Che Guevara described it as extremely complicated of a movement, but by far more positive than negative.
So just to get an idea of why you reject saying Peronism is a fascist ideology, what is your understanding of fascism? Like, how would you define fascism?
Well, I mean, I think the big thing when it comes to Peronism is people tend to look at Perron's quote unquote admiration for Mussolini in Italy. And I think that's probably the purest form, I think that's probably the purest form of fascism that we've seen implemented, in my opinion. I think Nazism obviously is a fascist ideology, but it was less
it's
complicated.
distinct from classical Italian fascism because Italian fascism said, we need to serve the needs of the state. And well, and you said those exact words in the video with Caleb Maupin, which is why I was like, oh wow, this sounds familiar. So, and I'm not trying to call you a fascist sympathizer at all. So I hope it doesn't come off that way. But what piqued my interest was that Italian fascists they said serve the needs of the state. Everyone is Italian, right? Everyone, and there were Italian fascists who argued that like anti-Semitism was anti-fascist because it stoked divisiveness on the basis of race, and so they rejected that. And of course, there were anti-Semitic fascists. They ended up signing the Pact of Steel anyway. But Nazism is fascism with a focus on race, which is why there's like so much anti-Semitism, anti-Slav sentiment in Nazi Germany. So yes, so I'm with you on there that Italian fascism is very distinct from Italian fascism, or sorry, Italian fascism is distinct from German fascism, who they were trying to socialize like a national identity on the basis of race, and so they are different. We recognize they are different, and I hope that contributes to what you were trying to say. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I agree completely. I think, a lot of people would say that Peronism is the Argentine counterpart to fascism, but I think it's kind of looked at the same way, in that I believe a lot of people would say the same thing about Leninism or the Soviet Union being a Russian interpretation of fascism, which I've heard people say.
That's wild.
Yeah, so and again, it's also important to look in the context of where Argentina was. Argentina, like a lot of countries in the third camp, in the non-aligned movement, didn't want to be allied with the Soviet Union, didn't want to be allied with the United States either. They wanted to be independent. Perón said that by the year 2000, Latin America will be united or it will be subjected. And that was something that Hugo Chavez talked about a lot too. He loved that quote by Perón. But I think it's, like I said, I think when it comes to Perón, I think there was an element of serving the state, which is questionable. But at the same time, Perón also said many, many times, true democracy is nothing without social justice. He said democracy is where the government does what the people want. The ultimate power is within the people. We need an organized community. We need to suppress so it's a lot of it. If I'm being 100% honest, I think Perón was very naive and somewhat ignorant. And I think a lot of people would agree with that assessment. in that he was ignorant in his admiration for political movements in Europe. You know, and it was also, it's at the same time, while the United States is blocking Peron from international trade, they're trying to isolate the Peronist regime, etc. Peron was looking for allies, you know, and no matter where they found themselves. So while he found an ally in Mao Zedong's China, he also found an ally in Franco's Spain. So more than anything, I think Peronism is pragmatic in that, you know, he was a big friend of Allende in Chile in the later years, but at the same time, he said to the more left radicals in his camp, he said, if you want to be idealistic and you want to go your route, look at what happens to Allende in Chile, you know, which is something that's understandable for a country that's outside of either camp and kind of looking for an independent route. So, you know, a lot could be said, but I think it's much more complicated than we think when it comes to defining Peronism as fascism.
Tell us a little bit how Perron came to power.
So Argentina had a story that was very much like a lot of Latin America in the latifundos and the oligarchy and foreign capitalist entities.
They were a colony, right? Sorry to interrupt you. Argentina was a colony.
Essentially, yeah. I mean, it was a little bit less clear cut than, you know, straight up. I mean, it was independent in name only, we'll say, as, you know, a lot of Latin America was at the time. Right. So Perron was able to run for president because he was arrested. So a lot of it also, so Perron met Eva Duarte at relief for an earthquake. There was a giant earthquake in Argentina where a lot of people didn't have jobs, a lot of people lost their homes, a lot of people died. And Eva Duarte was this famous actress, and Perron was a high-ranking military official, and they both went to the same event. They met each other, and the rest is history. But when Perron started speaking out against injustices, and when Perron started, he then moved into the Ministry of Labor, where he was seen as very pro-worker, he was very pro-union, he was about social housing, he was about unionization, he was about increasing wages, nationalization, all that kind of stuff. He was eventually arrested by the government at the time, and there was a huge movement of people demanding that he be released. And that was led at the time by Eva Perron, who was a radio broadcaster at the time. So he was eventually forced to be released by the crowds of people. And he then went on to run for president as the Labor Party candidate, the Argentine Labor Party. And he was elected. And that was seen, and you know, I've talked to people from Argentina. I have a lot of friends in Argentina, and one thing that they always say in common is that, you know, before Perron, the workers weren't anything. You know, they were dirt. And he was the first president to actually give a voice to the workers, to actually make the workers as part of the national plan, as part of the patria, etc. And so I think that's why Perron continues to be such a force in Argentine politics, because, and to a lot of people, Peronism is the Argentine equivalent to socialism. You know, there are socialist parties in Argentina, which are Trotskyist or, you know, Leninist, etc., that kind of thing. But when it comes to a socialism with national characteristics, Peronism is usually the one that comes to mind. But that's the basic story as to how he came to power. He made a name for himself in the military. He made a name for himself through his marriage with Eva Duarte, and he made a name for himself as Minister of Labor.
So when he was Minister of Labor, how did he what were some like pro-worker stances he took? How were they friendly to socialism or friendly to workers? And how, and if you could explain how it wasn't fashy, if that makes sense. Like I'm trying to understand, like, because everything I've read about Peronism, like, leads me to anything I can find in English, right? So I've got to, think that, leads me to think that there is something like fascist about it. So I'm trying to understand how it's not. Like I want to hear that. I would really appreciate it if you could get into that.
Well, during this time, the United States took a hardline stance against Perron, and they came out with what was known as, it was either the Blue Book or the White Book. I'm not 100% sure, but the ambassador to Argentina at the time, his name was Braden, and he accused Perron of being a fascist, of allying himself with the Axis powers, et cetera, et cetera. But really, I mean, when has the United States ever really been against the Axis, except when it was within the war? After the war, there was huge Nazi participation in NATO. There was huge Nazi participation in American weapons research, et cetera, et cetera. So, and a lot of people to this day believe that Braden's manifesto against Perron was more because he was more socialist oriented than anything. Perron then came out with the Blue and White Book, which are the national colors of Argentina, and it completely blew up in Braden and the United States' face, and that was one of the big reasons as to why he got elected. But so a lot of what Perron was able to do for the workers didn't happen until he was president. A lot of what went on while he was minister was rhetorical, simply because, I mean, he met with the unions and he consolidated the unions into a big union as opposed to fragmented pieces, which was a big deal. But the big thing was one of the first measures of Perron was a new constitution in 1949. And a big part of that constitution was the Workers' Bill of Rights, which was the right to work, the right to a fair remuneration. And, they're very Marxist concepts. Perron would have said that he was against Marxism, as a lot of people in the third world socialists and communists always kind of said that. But some of the things that were enumerated in the Constitution, like work is the indispensable means to satisfy the spiritual and material needs of the individual and their community. Under Article 2, the right to a fair remuneration, he said, wealth, income, and interest of capital is the exclusive outcome of human labor, and the community must organize and reactivate the sources of production to make possible and ensure for the worker a moral and material remuneration. It incorporated the right to welfare, the right to Social Security, the right to the preservation of health, appropriate working conditions, better economic conditions, protection of the family, etc. And that was one of the very first things that he did. He also enshrined the right to unionization, which was under attack by the previous regime. He identified, in the 20 Peronist principles, he said that in the new Argentina, work is a right which dignifies man. It is only fair that each should produce at least what he consumes, and that what could also be called from each according to his ability to each according to his need. There's only one class of men for the Peronist cause, and that is the workers. As an economic doctrine, Peronism achieves a true form of social economy by placing capital at the service of the national economy, and this at the service of social welfare. And these are things, also obviously you have the largest expansion of education in the history of Argentina, more schools built during the Peronist periods than in the rest of Argentine history. You have, Perron once said that his number one accomplishment was making education free, in that making students of the workers and students of the oligarchy going to the same schools was a huge part of his ideology and a huge part of his accomplishments. Obviously the construction of hospitals, and when also you must take into consideration the foundation Isabel Perron. Isabel Perron famously said that foreign capitalism and its oligarchic servants can never subdue a people that is aware of its rights. And in that, she constructed, and this is chronicled a little bit in the movie and play Evita, but the Eva Peron Foundation, which was an extension of the government, they provided sewing machines and refrigerators and shoes, clothing, tools, jobs. They built entire cities for workers that still exists to this day. Ciudad Evita in Argentina is a working class city, which was built specifically so workers had a place to live. They built homes, they built mini cities for children, for the children of workers. So it was a lot of, and obviously this is within the constraints of much of the world is in the constraints of the Cold War. People are being placed into camps. The United States is the Marshall Plan completely evaded Argentina because of its socialist leanings at the time. So again, a lot of the things, also a lot of it is based within Christianity, because there's an element of Christian socialism in all of this. Eva Peron talked a lot about how God is always on the side of the exploited, how God is always at the service of the people and things like that, which many people to this day, if there's a picture of Saint Guadalupe in people's homes in Argentina, there's a lot of times also portraits of Peron and Evita, because she was seen as a saint-like figure. And it also a famous what's it called? Like a personal thing, not an antidote, but antidote, something like that. About Eva Peron was anecdote. Yes.
Nope.
A famous anecdote about Eva Peron was when she went on a tour across Europe to rally support for Peron and to get allies. She got into an argument with Franco's wife because Franco's wife kept accusing them of being communists because Eva wanted to go to the working class neighborhoods. And she said, those are red neighborhoods, we don't go there, blah, blah, blah. And Eva Peron said, Peron's only in power because of the workers. You guys are in power because of a violent overthrow. And they were never alone again. So it's, so when it comes to, and to this day, a lot of the instances in the Constitution in Argentina are thanks to Peronism. Some of the most cherished by the workers, even elements of the Constitution under Allende took note from the Argentine constitutional scholar Senpai, who helped write the Peronist Constitution. He was invited to lecture in Chile under Allende, and he helped, he was an advisor to helping write the Chilean Constitution at the time.
Yeah, and it looks like, is this correct that his wife took over at a certain point, right?
So when Perrone died, his second wife, Isabel, took over. Now that was a very, very dark period. That's where a lot of people who say that, Peronism is fascism, that's where a lot of people point to, because when Perrone died, as happens a lot of time, there was to convert, Perrone was what kept the coalition alive. It's what kept the far left commies in. He's what kept, some of the people on the right, more conservative elements, but he was the general, he was the conductor, the teacher, whatever. And he kept everyone in line. Once he died and Isabel Perron took the baton, elements in the military who were much more conservative, much more right-wing, got a lot more say. And so they founded the AAA, an anti-communist alliance of death squads, which hunted Peronist left-wing militants. That was a very, very dark period. And that's something that, a lot of Peronists will disavow, at least the Peronists that I identify with, because that was a complete aberration in the mindset of the left Peronists as to what Peronism was. Not only was it neoliberal, not only was it accepting of completely getting rid of social justice, economic independence, and political sovereignty, but it was attacking Peronists. It was killing them. It was jailing them, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think this kind of goes into Operation Condor.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we should talk about what that was about and how that specifically impacted Argentina, because it got hit pretty bad with Operation Condor.
Yeah, so Isabel Perron, who was Perron's second wife, the one that we just talked about, she was eventually overthrown in a coup. And that's when things got even worse. You know, things were bad under Isabel, in my opinion, you know, especially for the left. And there was a lot of repression, and there was a lot of a reinvigoration of the right wing. But things got much worse once Isabel was overthrown. You had people, you know, you had Vargas, a general in the military, who took over with as part of Operation Condor. And it was a military junta. It was part of the dirty war, you know, where the famous cases of all these babies whose parents were left-wing militants or just left-wing intellectuals, or even maybe thought the wrong way, were murdered, and their children were taken away and given to supporters of the government, which to this day they still are. It's still a struggle, and they're still finding children. There's human rights organizations like the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo and the Abuelas de la Plaza de Mayo, Hibe de Bonafini, etc., human rights organizations which are dedicated to recovering these children. You know, so more atrocities committed in the name of, you know, spreading democracy. As Simon Bolivar said, you know, the United States will bring atrocities to Latin America in the name of democracy, in the name of human rights. And that was no different for Argentina. Even like, you know, a big deal for a lot of the people during the last 10, 20 years was that a lot of the people who were elected president, people like Dilma Rousseff, Christina Kirchner, even Michelle Bachelet, who I am not a fan of at all, but these are people who were persecuted, people who were chased, people who were sometimes tortured by United States-backed regimes, who are now popularly elected presidents in some cases. So that was a big deal for a lot of people, and it was kind of seen as a direct result of the Operation Condor.
So with everything that you're telling me now, it sounds like, especially considering that, you know, they were part of, like, you know, just because you're a third position, you're not aligned with the United States, you're not aligned with the Soviet Union, doesn't automatically make you a fascist. And that, like, but it's also important to consider, so because of that, would you say that calling Peronism fascism is kind of a bourgeois understanding of what Peronism is? Because if a lot of academics are saying it's fascism, it's because, like, to me, they're just using that as a buzzword because it goes against the status quo and it's against US imperialism. So I'm wondering if you could go into how Peronism is anti-imperialist here.
In my opinion, I do think it's very, well, maybe, yeah, I think it's a bourgeoisistic viewpoint in that regard. You know, Perron, one of the main things, so in terms of anti-imperialism, he nationalized all the British-owned railways, which was a huge deal. And, you know, at the time there was a left-wing government in Britain, but, you know, even the left-wing government in Britain was still hostile, obviously, to sovereign movements in its foreign colonies and its subsidiaries. But so I feel like a lot of, like you said, the third position, and I feel like a lot of Argentines will tell me that Peronism is very comparable to Nasserism in Egypt, like Arab socialism, in that it's a regional variant of socialism that takes into consideration national characteristics and things like that, which some people consider that, I mean, as you guys know, a lot of people consider that automatically fascist, in that we get painted with that same brush. So it's, and I mean, even when you look at like, so when Che Guevara died, when he was murdered by US agents in Bolivia, the Communist Party of Argentina was against Che. They said he was an adventurist. They didn't write, and this is when the man died. This is after the Cuban Revolution. This is when he was continuing his revolutionary struggle across the continent. He was murdered, and the communists had nothing good to say. But it was Perrone who came out and said, comrades, with deep sorrow, I have received the news of an irreplaceable loss for the struggle of the peoples who are fighting for their revolution and liberation. We have embraced this ideal. We feel twinned with all those who in any part of the world and under any banner fight against injustice, misery, and exploitation. Che Guevara's death tears apart my soul. He was one of ours. He was an example of behavior, of detachment, a spirit of sacrifice. Some cables pretend to present him as an enemy of Peronism. Nothing could be more absurd. Supposing that this would be true, that back in 1951, he would have been linked to a coup attempt. What age was he back then? What matters is to realize those mistakes and make them right. Che amended them. When in Guatemala, a conflict in defense of the government of Jacobo Benz from the armed intervention of the Yankees, he personally gave instructions to the foreign ministry in order to solve this tough situation. News has reached my ears that the Argentinian Communist Party covertly is going through a campaign of discredit. This must not surprise us, given that it has always marched on the side of the national historical process. It has always been against national and popular movements. We Peronists can give faith about that. So, and I think Perron was eventually, that I think is very powerful, in that while communists were supposedly anti-imperialists, are supposedly anti-colonialists, when one of the number one anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist fighters in the history of the world from their own country has been killed by the number one imperial power in the world, they couldn't be bothered to say anything positive, while Perron was the one that said bombastically that he was as Peronist as anyone else, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I mean, a lot of also what Perron did was, when it came to nationalizations, I talked about the nationalization of the railways, but he also nationalized grain exports. He nationalized the ports. He nationalized trading. So, and a lot of that trade was with the United Kingdom at the time, and it gave more preferential treatment to Argentine commodities and to the Argentine economy. Obviously, this is something that's never been good in the eyes of the UK or the US or the imperial power of any time. And there's evidence that the United States was involved in the coup against Perron after the death of Eva. So, I mean, I think one has to look at who Perron's enemies were. He had enemies in the oligarchy. He had enemies in sympathizers. The rich couldn't stand Perron. The rich couldn't stand Eva. They didn't, it was tradition in Argentina to invite the first lady to be the head of the charitable organizations. They refused to do so because she was the child of a worker, because her parents weren't married, because she was the wife of Perron. So I think you look at the enemies that he had made and you see that he is, in my opinion, on the side of liberation and against exploitation.
It sounds a lot like Iran a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that like if it's fair to say that Argentina plays the same role or plays a similar role to what Iran plays in their region of the world. Mm-hmm. Right? Would you agree with that?
In terms of what exactly?
In terms of just like nationalizing stuff, taking a lot of pro-worker stances, anti-imperialist stances, not aligning with the United States or the Soviet Union, and just taking a strong anti-imperialist stance.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, because like they also take a position that they're neither socialist or capitalist either.
Hmm. And I think, for the faults in that, when I say that Perron was pragmatic, one of the first things he did foreign policy wise was open up trade with the Soviet Union. So it's not like he was very wary, as a lot of third world leaders were, of intervention in his state's affairs. He did not want to be influenced. He was big on independence, and he saw, the relationship between China and the Soviet Union as somewhat imperialist, and again, these are things that people on the left disagree with, etc. But I think that, I think him being like extremely against imperialism, extremely against intervention, isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's it could explain his hostility towards Soviet communism.
Yeah. Well, so then what's your take on the current president, Alberto Fernandez? Is he a Peronist? What's the current state of affairs in Argentina now? Is it moving in a progressive direction? Is it regressing? What's your take?
So a lot of my Argentine friends will be glad I'm speaking about this, but a lot of them will be not so glad, but it needs to be said. So it's important we go back a little bit. So when Argentina was on the brink in the early 2000s, they defaulted, the largest sovereign default on debt in the history of the world. The IMF, they were following the guidelines, they were doing austerity, people were screwed, unemployment was terrible, inflation was terrible, etc. They went through, I believe it was 5 presidents in 7 days. Eventually Nestor Kishner was elected president, and he went against the IMF. He went against austerity. He said, we need to invest in our people. He said, we're not gonna, the dead don't pay debts, he said. So we're not going to take your structural adjustment programs anymore. And Argentina experienced record economic growth, 9 to 10% per year during this period. And he paid off the debt. Yeah, he paid off the debt to the IMF in one large sum, before it incurred any more interest. He said, we want to be sovereign, just take the money and go. And a lot of people on the left said that he shouldn't have paid any of it at all. But in the world of, being pragmatic, if you don't pay it, that can be very, very detrimental in terms of development. If you're an underdeveloped country, you can't get loans on the international stage, et cetera, et cetera. So I see both sides in that. I don't have, I think Kishner was probably, I do believe he was right in paying it, just that I feel like it would have been much worse off down the road. He made sure to pay it off with the least amount of interest, and while feeding his people. So it wasn't at the expense of the people. Eventually, his wife and senator and national deputy, Christina Fernandez Kishner, takes over. They go on to, so Christina's presidency, 3 years into it, Nestor dies. He dies of a heart attack. And this is kind of seen as a turning point in Kirchnerismo. So before he had died, Christina's administration was in a huge fight with the latifundos. They were trying to increase export taxes on the soy exporters. I believe it was from 3 to 10% or something like that. Something not outrageous, but they were making huge sums of money. Their taxes hadn't gone up, and Kirchnerism was big on redistribution. They were big on being a worker, etc. So they wanted to increase tax revenue, and they brought the country to a halt. They burned grain. They refused to sell. There was smoke in Buenos Aires from all the grain that they were burning. And Christina, came out and said that these are extortionists, these are terrorists. We won't. I govern for the Argentines, not for the corporations. Her vice president was then, he went on to take it's similar in the United States how the vice president takes on the tie-breaking vote in the Senate should there be a tie. He went against the president and he voted against her, and the Latifundos won that round. So that was like the first change in discourse, you know, and then Nestor died and it became even worse, the polarization. So Christina went on to, she did really amazing things for Argentina. I consider myself a Kirchnerista. I'm totally in favor of Nestor. I'm totally in favor of Christina, absolutely. So take that with a grain of salt. But you know, she did things like the universal child allowance, which reached millions of children, boosted child attendance by 5% or so. I think it was 3.9% exactly. Poverty fell, inflation was under control. Unemployment was the lowest in like 30 years. Wages were rising much higher than inflation. She nationalized a Spanish-owned oil giant. She nationalized pension funds. She gave her support to the co-op community in Argentina, which was facing repression under the previous administration. She was realigning with China, with Iran, with Venezuela. She was very close to Hugo Chavez. You know, so there was a lot of geopolitical stuff going on there as well when it came to the United States. And but so she also, another big thing that she did was she tried to do a media conglomerate law to break up, you know, capitalist concentration of media, selling, you know, and that was mainly going against Clarín, which is a media monopoly in Argentina, which is famously right-wing, famously supported the dictatorship, etc., and was very anti-Kirchnerista, and still is to this day. You know, you saw during this time, you saw spray paint in Buenos Aires saying Clarín miente, Clarín lies. So it was a very good period for the Argentine workers. It was a very good period for the Argentine people. The election that Christina was reelected with, she won 54% of the vote in a vote with like 5 candidates. So she, you know, it was an amazing win. I think it was the second largest win in the history of Argentina after only Juan Perón. So there was, and then the election in 2015 happened, and it's a very long, complicated geopolitical story as to what happened in Argentina in 2014, 2015 in the run-up to this election. But to give you the spark notes of it, essentially there was a terrorist attack in Argentina decades ago, which on a Jewish community center. Israel believed that it was Iran that was involved. And Christina said no. So for years they didn't get any progress on this. So Christina signed an agreement with Iran for them to go ahead with an investigation because she said she believed that Iran was not involved. And the prosecutor that Nestor had named to, so it's called AMIA, it was the AMIA Community Center. So he appointed this man, Alberto Nisman, to investigate AMIA and come up with his conclusions, etc. It then came out that he had hundreds of thousands of dollars in offshore bank accounts in the United States. He continuously met with the United States ambassador in the United States embassy. There's WikiLeaks cables that show that the ambassador said to him, no, it's not anyone else. Stop looking at other people. It is the Iranians. Go after Iran. And then when Christina signed this agreement with Iran, he then drafted an arrest warrant for Christina and was set to present his findings to Congress the next day. He was murdered. A day before he was set to testify before Congress. So obviously it's very like spy thriller.
Yeah.
Did he deserve it?
I'm sorry.
Did he deserve it?
I mean, I believe that he was an asset of the CIA. I believe that he was trying and he was being used to take down Christina's government, and he was being used to attack Iran, especially in the context of like the Iran nuclear deal and Israel under Netanyahu, this far right. You know, it was very geopolitical.
Yeah.
And it was, they used it day and night, and that's one of the main reasons. The media, when, Christina is a murderer, she shot him, like, just absolute ridiculousness. And in the onslaught of this terrible media campaign and this propaganda and this meddling, they lost the election in 2015 by like less than a percentage point. So even with all of this going on, they still lost in a very small margin. But,
wow.
And if you look at WikiLeaks cables, like, so there's members of the Argentine intelligence community who had links to the United States who are believed to have murdered Alberto Nisman in order to make it seem as though it was segments of Christina, as if it was people sent by Christina in order to tarnish her government. And you can look this up. It's a really big deal. There's a great Netflix documentary called, I think it's The Spy, the Prosecutor, and the President. They get a couple things wrong, but it's good for, a base knowledge. So, and in response to this, Christina dissolved the intelligence agency because she believed it was corrupt from the bottom up and there was foreign influence, and she was done. But then they went to the, and then some, and then have some trials.
That's totally nuts. And so she is under the Peronism umbrella then, right?
Yes.
Because it's more of like a national political identity really than an ideology is because there's like a left wing and a right wing within that, from what I'm hearing.
And Christina represents the more left elements.
And so how does the current president fit in? Like where does he fit in? I think you were leading up to that.
Yeah, so he was Nestor's chief of staff, and he continued being the chief of staff under Christina until she started going in a more radical route. Then he resigned and he became a big critic of Christina and Kirchnerismo. That's why a lot of people, so fast forward, they had the election in 2015. They narrowly elected this US-backed, IMF-backed millionaire who took out the largest IMF loan in the history of the country, destroyed the industrial capacity of the country, completely eviscerated it. Unemployment was soaring, inflation was soaring, everything was terrible. Wages were, just scorched earth was what it was described as. Fast forward to 2019, opinion polls put Christina ahead, as she was the leader of the opposition to Mauricio Macri, the neoliberal, and she was put ahead, but there was a lot of internal discussion as to how they would govern going forward. And so the hardline Kirchneristas would have supported Christina no matter what, but it was people in the middle that they kind of needed to convince. So in order to do this grand coalition, Christina said, I will run as vice president, Alberto will run as president. I will be the leader of the Senate in my capacity as vice president. He will be the president. I will be president when he's overseas, etc. It'll be this governing coalition. So, and they won in the first round. It was, a blowout. But Alberto represents the more centrist Peronism, or a Kirchnerismo for the center, because Kirchnerismo is seen as more radical, but
like a center left.
in term, yeah.
Okay.
But Kirchnerismo was seen as more left-wing. So in order to kind of bring these elements together, and so they founded the Frente de Todos, everyone's front. And that includes the Communist Party, it includes, you know, more center parties, you know, it's a very big coalition, hence the name. It's everyone's
populism.
front.
It's left-wing populism. So, I mean, yeah, it definitely doesn't sound, yeah, I think that I have been convinced that, I mean, convinced more than I already was that that it's left-wing populism. That I mean, I definitely support it. And I hope that here in the United States, we can do something, you know, similar, because I mean, we have no opposition to Republicans and Democrats. I mean, there's nothing, all of these like socialist parties or book clubs, and like they're not reaching the masses, and like anti-communism is the it's the unofficial religion of the United States. So you know, arguably, you know, if we're going to call anything fascist between Argentina and the United States, it's definitely, you know, way more the United States, who have slowly been implementing Nazi policies for years. You know, I just think it's really, really interesting. Yeah, I just think it's really, really, really interesting how I want to know how all these how scholars get to this conclusion that Argentina is a fascist country, and because I understand where liberals are coming from when they draw conclusions like, oh, Trump is a fascist or Gaddafi's a fascist, and I'm like, y'all are just unaware of who you are. Sorry to tell you about yourselves.
I think it's part of that whole milieu that thinks it's just fashionable to call everyone and everyone that they don't like either a Russian asset or a fascist or a noseball or a class reductionist or, you know, so I think that's permeated kind of down from the academic circles down to like the run-of-the-mill liberals. And I think that's not an accident and stuff like that. So, and, you know, I just want to, you know, be clear about Alberto Fernandez. You know, he took a lot of popular stances during the COVID pandemic, and you know, economically they did a wealth tax. They gave asylum to Evo Morales so he could go to Mexico under the leadership of AMLO, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, another person who's seen as a left-wing populist. He has a book in English if you guys are interested at all. And you know, so, but again, it's important to note that it's a coalition. So there has been some cracks. There has been some internal discussion. A friend of mine, Alicia Castro, she was set to become the ambassador, the Argentine ambassador to Russia. And then the foreign minister of Argentina, Felipe Sola, who is seen as more of a centrist, took an anti-Venezuela stand. And she resigned. She said, I can't participate. I have huge respect for Christina. Christina is the reason we're here. Yeah. So that was a big deal. You know, and she's very involved in like Julian Assange defense, and she's very great in terms of Venezuela. And, you know, Christina is, you know, it's part of the coalition. There's parts of the coalition that are like, no, we need to be a little bit more critical of Venezuela. And then there's the Kishner sectors and La Cámpora and, you know, my sectors that I tend to say that I belong to are obviously like, no, leave Venezuela alone. Venezuela is an ally and a fabulous example. But, you know, so he's walking a tightrope. And at the same time, he has this massive IMF loan to contend with. At the same time, industrial capacity is so depleted because of the years of Macri, you know, so it's an interesting situation. But, you know, and I've said it before, my loyalty when it comes to Argentina is with Christina. You know, if Christina was not running as the vice president, I wouldn't have supported that ticket. If it wasn't a marriage of these different forces, I wouldn't have done that. But you know, time will tell. I think the pandemic has kind of thrown a lot of things off track, but there's been a lot of good coming out of Argentina in terms of the wealth tax, in terms of freezing utility hikes, in terms of granting asylum to Evo Morales and Bolivian socialists, coordinating with Mexico, and Christina keeps good links with Rafael Correa and Pablo Iglesias from Spain, etc. So it's so is politics,
Yeah, and I think this is a great place to end it. I think this is a great lesson on Argentina and Peronism. So before we wrap up, remind everyone where they can find you, and maybe where can people learn more about Peronism and Argentina, Argentinian politics, you think? Where are some good sources?
So so I can be found, I'm at facebook.com/dakotah.lily.9. My Instagram is Gringo Chavista. I love being asked questions. I love doing stuff like this. So that's me. In terms of Argentine, I think Telesur is a really good source for Argentine politics. Telesur English is a really good source. I'm trying to think about in English. I mean, also, let me say this, downloading Google Chrome, which automatically translates web pages, is a real lifesaver when it comes to trying to find good news sources and stuff like that. So if people are inclined to do that, there's Nacional y Popular, National and Popular.com. You can look at organizations like La Campora, LACMPORA, the Peronist Current Descamisados is a good one. I'm trying to, probably the biggest one would be Telesur, because they have the Spanish and English, but also RT does good coverage of Argentina a lot of the time. Let me see if I have, in terms of books, there's a book by a right-winger, Kerry Bolton, who also wrote about Stalin, interestingly enough. But his book, Peron and Peronism, is pretty good. Take it with a grain of salt. It's coming from someone who's on the right.
Right.
There's Christina's website is very good, cfkargentina.com. I think that would be a good primer, but like I said, it's hard to come in contact with. Mark Weisbrot did a good book on the economics of the world. What was his? And he talked a lot about Argentina and Kirchnerismo, as well as Venezuela, and all these other fabulous examples. I think it was called "What the World Got Wrong." If you just look up Mark Weisbrot, I'm sure it'll come up. Weisbrot, Weisbrot.
Dakotah, thank you so much for joining us again this evening. This has been a very wonderful, insightful, and pleasant conversation. We look forward to having you back on. Keep up your work. If you come across really good articles, please send them my way. It doesn't matter if they're in Spanish. I can translate them, or try to read them in Spanish. Ooh. But thank you again for joining us.
And thank you guys. I love this show. I love being on the show. I love y'all. Anytime you guys need a guest or anything, it's truly it's my pleasure.
That's so sweet. We love you. So we really appreciate that. It means a lot. Thank you.
We're Dakotah Lilly stands in this house.
We're Dakotah Lilly-ists?
Yeah, we're
Lily.
Dakotah Lilly.
Oh God. I have such a shitty name for an ideology.
Oh my God, no, I think it's really cute. We love it.